Okay, so here are some of the large exporting FIEs. It's not the whole list, but it's the ones that I thought might look familiar to you, might be of interest to you. And I'll give you a chance to look at them and tell me what you think. They're all pretty much over $1 billion of export volume, so they're pretty large. What strikes you? The what? A lot of electronics, yeah. Motorola, Nokia, Samsung, Motorola. A lot of the names repeat, very incestuous, and they're all joint ventures. You have a Western or Japanese together with a local Chinese. All right, so there are certain sectors, a lot of JVs, all JVs, and again, a lot of repeating. BenQ on their own there, but Fuji, Sierra, that's Japanese. But a lot of the others, you can see they're all partnered, and again, a lot of repeats. So I think that's pretty striking. Large volume, a lot of JVs, certain sectors. For instance, Siemens, I don't have up here, Siemens had a reputation for having the largest number of joint ventures in the Shanghai area. I don't know what the number was, but it was close to 100 probably. They had joint ventures everywhere. So they just keep partnering with whoever suits them.
Paul?
Yeah.
Question, mentioned Dell, who I mentioned my son is working there right now in China. Two-part question. One, how are they structured relative there? And also, where's General Electric on this between?
I don't think General Electric has a joint venture. I think they have a China manager, a country manager, and they just go in, and if they do a power plant or something of that sort, then they'll just go in and do a contract and set it up. So I don't think they have partners as these companies do. I mean, a joint venture, you create a new entity. And so I don't think GE does. I don't think Dell does either. My understanding is Dell went to Xiamen, they set up a plant, and they're trying to do the same model there as they do here, but without a joint venture. The problem with Dell is here I have a Dell direct model. They don't go through retailers and credits. And in China, they have some problems because Chinese like to see what they buy. So there might be some retail and relationship. As far as Dell, that's about all I know about those two companies.
They are transitioning engineering from Austin, Texas over there.
Right, but that...
Something's involved with that. 450 engineers got laid off here and hired in Shanghai.
Yeah, because they're manufacturing over there, but I don't think they have a partner that they're working with. So it's just Dell China. It's not Dell / Shanghai government or.
What's that? XIAMEN. Dell.
Oh, Xiamen. That's the city where they are.
Oh, just the city. Okay.
Right. Okay. Here are some indicators. I'll go quickly through these. SOEs, collectives, and foreign. The number of enterprises, you can see where there are more here than there are the others now. What's interesting, though, the number that lose money. A lot of these companies in China lose money. I mean, very few are profitable. Assets. Again, SOEs, more assets. SOEs are asset intense. For the reasons I mentioned, they're bloated because they're forced to buy other businesses even though they're not very productive. Sales revenue comparisons. So we're actually here collectives also pretty much sales. I'm looking at sales and assets comparisons. And then total profits. SOEs, though, seem to do pretty well compared to these others. So just to give you some comparison. Now, keep in mind that the top Chinese companies are all state-owned. Whether they're on the stock exchange, whether they've gone public, they're still these large former SOEs. And these companies, they may be, they're not traded in the stock market. Even if they're from Hong Kong or Macau, Chinese have to buy another class of stock. They can't always buy that A class. Okay, and last, employment differences. So give you some idea of some of these comparisons. And again, here's the foreign companies, pretty high employment, same as the SOEs. So it looks like the foreign overseas in Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan have a pretty good presence in terms of these companies in China. What I did here is I took some of these companies that we've talked about and some other companies, and I wanted to see how they're organized. And it's very complex, very complex. The data is a few years old now. Higher is very large, successful appliance company. If you go to Walmart and you buy any small appliance like a fridge, cooler, microwave, you bought Chinese. Whatever it says, you know, it's a higher company. But they've also, they've got a plant in South Carolina, so they've come here as well. Next to Haier, you see SOE, SC, SHK. If you look down here, Haier is a state-owned enterprise. It's also a shareholding collective. It's traded on Shanghai, it's traded on Hong Kong. Now, some of those things, when you read it, to me, it doesn't make sense. How could you be these two, three things at once? But yet, they're able to do it, and I've never gotten a good answer from anybody I know over there. Large company, they tried to purchase Maytag. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, Maytag went on a block. Haier took a bid. So it's not just Chinese selling to us, but buying companies potentially as well. They export 11.5%. They've got about half of our market for small refrigerators. Now, Huawei is on a Shanghai Stock Exchange. The Cisco controversy is this. Huawei competes with Cisco. They make routers and all the internet stuff that, you know, is pretty important, the infrastructure stuff. Cisco accused them of taking their technology, but they lost that case. So they compete head to head. Export 20%, they have 3% of the local market, total market, global market. Legend, it's an SOE, also on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. They purchased IBM. They changed their name to Lenovo, and if you follow that, IBM does not make computers. If you buy a ThinkPad, it's made by a Chinese company. You bought China as well. Okay, and you can see, well, NA on the export, because the Lenovo part is pretty much domestic. There's still like a 2 or 3 year time period until they will have all of IBM. 20% of the market for motherboards globally. Let's see, this one, this is the interior, Sichuan's the interior. I think this was a former military general who took it over. They make this brand, again, pretty global, TVs, DVDs, all these electronics. Export 44%, 10% of our market. And, this is automotive parts. I'll talk a little bit more about these companies in a couple of minutes. But this company actually bought a failing company in Chicago. A lot of these companies, therefore, are really global. They're really in the US. So it's not just that they're exporting to us. But I wanted you to look at some of these little notations I made because, again, these structures, to me, don't really make a lot of sense. That they can be 2 or 3 different kinds of structures simultaneously, which to me, I think, are opposites. A China expert, Wharton, once said this: unlike the firms portrayed in Western organizational theory, large Chinese firms often consist of affiliated companies organized like families. Parents, children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren, all having independent legal status. Like families, these companies do not have clearly defined boundaries. Boundaries between the firm and the state on the one hand, and the firm and subsidiaries on the other are indefinite, and hence managers must continuously negotiate both kinds of boundaries. Talking about the complexity of these, let me show you exactly what it looks like. This is a cluster. This is a trading cluster. Now, on the top, Hubei, wholesale and retail. Hubei is a province, 2 provinces west of Shanghai. On the top, you see Wuhan, Chang Investment. Wuhan is the capital city. So a lot of these names you'll see Wuhan or Hubei, or you see Shanghai. So that's where the names come from. The boxes are referred to as bridging firms. They make these connections. And then the different letters are these different types of businesses that they're in. And you can see they're in all kinds of businesses, right? It's like this example of the steel I mentioned before. Italics are the ones that are not controlled by the state. So most of these are state controlled. Even though they might issue stock, they might be public, state is still very controlling. All right, so this is one cluster. Here's another cluster. This is the bank industrial cluster. Pudong Development Bank, and then Shanghai New Asia. But then you see other kinds of businesses. Some are italic, some are not. Different letters. All right, so you've got these bridging firms, and you've got all these affiliates, and so on. I was at this conference I mentioned when I went there a year ago, and I was given a paper just before my paper these authors gave this paper, and they had a more extensive listing of companies, and somewhere down they had this Dajong taxi company. So I got up and I told them, it really struck me because I had interviewed the chairman of the board, top managers, a few years earlier at Dajong, and they were telling me about this wonderful strategy. The taxi company was going to go into logistics. They were going to go take all of their routing of taxis and apply it to warehousing, transportation, distribution. They were going to really go big. And I thought it sounded pretty impressive. Well, they never told me that they were part of this group. So if you go high up enough, there's a bank, there's money, there's government injecting funds, forcing them to give them money, you know. And these games, these shell games are being played. I'll give you some more information related to this later as well, but this is kind of the pattern. So they weren't very transparent to me. They never really came forward and said, oh, by the way, here's the bigger organization structure. We're part of this other group. And they were buried way down deep. So you've got these big clusters that are allied. The leader of the year, just a side story, in this meeting we had, in this conversation transpired, the chairwoman was pretty boastful about their strategy, and then she said, oh, by the way, one of our managers is leader of the year. And I don't know, it was Shanghai or China or the industry, whatever it was, leader of the year. So I said, I'd like to meet this guy. And she hesitated, and she goes, okay. So I was with a colleague of mine who's Chinese, and we get back to the hotel room, and I said, call this guy up. You know, we got him, you know, it was on a Friday. I said, let's go meet him on this weekend. And he said, he's not going to meet you. I go, what are you talking about? Chairman just said it's okay. He's not going to meet you. And I said, look, here's a number, call him. He started shaking his head. He called, dutifully called. Friday, Saturday, Sunday go by. Monday, he goes, I told you so. I go, how did you know? He goes, I'm Chinese. I knew what she was communicating. You know, Chinese don't say yes or no, they say yes, no. You know, so even though the chairwoman was saying it's okay, he knew there was no way in a snowball in hell that we were going to meet this guy. And he said, you know, you're wasting your time. But I was being the Westerner, taking it literally, but he understood the subtle cues. And then he went on to give me a list of reasons why he didn't see me, you know, and there's a long list. Basically, there's no relationship, no connection, nothing in it for him, you know, the whole usual kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting side story. But in terms of this cluster, they are just not very open about where everything lies. It gets better because those two clusters are part of a bigger cluster. All right, and so you've got these relationships, which explains the steel company example I mentioned before. All right, so it turns out that most of these listed companies belong to a cluster. They're being diversified, being a holding company or trading company facilitates operations. You need someone to give you raw materials. You need someone to move the stuff. You need someone to distribute the stuff. You know, so it facilitates these transactions, these operations, but they're connected either by cash. An interlock is when the same person is on multiple boards, all right? So they're on each other's, you know, top management boards and so on, or they have trade relations, marketing channels. They kind of work together in this way. What's also interesting is almost a third of their earnings come from these other companies. So it's like getting dividends. Now think about all the double counting that occurs. If you trace all this money, and a third is profit that somebody else reported, and a third of that is from somebody else, and you know, a third. It's so intertwined. It's really hard to get a handle on how much money we're talking about, or how little money we're talking about, because it's money coming from dividends from somebody else, because all of these connections that they have. And it's always dominated by some SOEs. There's some big gorilla in the middle of all this. So this is kind of the complex structure that I was leading up to. All right, let's move on. Global trade. There's no nation which does not need to borrow from others. Okay, let's pick up our long history of Silk Road and trade imbalance. There's China versus the US. China exports 970, imports 752. Again, they sell more than they buy, and we're the opposite. Now, is it us versus them, or is it us versus us? You know, Pogo once said, I've seen the enemy, and it is us. So here's where we're looking at. The major exports for China, the major imports, And for the US, major exports, major imports. But here's what I found fascinating. I didn't have current data. This goes back to 2003. I couldn't find more recent data. But in 2003, FIEs, what's an FIE stand for again? I'm going to quiz you before you leave. All right, just checking. A foreign invested enterprise. Of the exports, over half were FIEs. And they're growing 41%. Imports, over half FIEs, they're growing 45%. Now think about it. What's the implication of that? How would you interpret that? Simple number, those two simple numbers. The impression we get is you get these Chinese in the villages setting up a factory selling stuff to us. They're selling bad toothpaste, bad dog food, and bad toys, right? Or shoddy clothes. No. A lot of that trade deficit is GE and Dell going over there, buying US parts, making stuff, selling US goods to us. So we're buying stuff from there that's made from American companies. The trade data is very hard to really get a handle on because of that, because once you go global, you know, everything gets so kind of homogenized, right? It's all mixed in there. So be very careful and get these impressions that, oh my God, they're invading us. It's not they, it's not us versus them, it's us versus us. It's this outsourcing, it's these jobs going overseas, right? And maybe they pay less overseas for the same US engineers, but it's still Dell selling to us. They're just making it in China. So if you're keeping track of imports and exports, that Dell counts as a Chinese export. But it's really US dividend and so on. Data gets really screwy, so be cautious of that. Okay, here are the 4 top partners for both sides. Neighborly trade. A lot of trade occurs because of proximity. East Asia over there. Now we're pretty big, we're 21%. And for the imports, we're not as big as these guys are here. For Chinese imports, they import more from these guys. They sell more to us than they do there. But here, you got NAFTA, North American Free Trade, right? And so, yeah, we export 5% to China, a lot more here. Well, we import 60% from China, but we import the same from Canada. No one's bashing on Canada except, you know, hockey season or something. But, you know, no one's picking on these guys because we like our neighbors, we're part of NAFTA. But when you look at the numbers, you know, it seems to be a little bit unfair. Most trade tends to be based on proximity, and then Japan is also pretty prominent. All right? Lastly, debt. They've got that much in debt. Look at our debt. Big debt, right? This is the current data, and you know, we've had a big buildup last couple of years. Okay, $1 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. Look where we are, foreign exchange reserves. But remember what I told you. If they actually pay out those failing loans, they really get the pension in order, and they build the infrastructure, that's going to cost $1 trillion right off the top. So you got to be a little careful of that. On the other hand, our infrastructure, our pensions, we're in the kind of the same bind. We don't have the reserves they have. Trade imbalance. The point is, we're all in this thing together. You know, if the boat goes down, we all drown. Okay. Another problem with the Chinese company is there really aren't any Chinese global brands. How many of you go in the store and ask for a hire? You know, so they are big on manufacturing, low cost, but they don't have international brands for 3 reasons. One is they're not really one country. They've got multiple economies. Pearl River is by Hong Kong, Yangtze River is Shanghai, Bohai is up by Beijing. Those 3 areas I mentioned before are 3 distinct regions. Each province protects its own local industry. There's a lot more barriers to trade between provinces, okay, than internationally. For instance, if you go to China, you will notice the ubiquitous little blue truck. These little pickup trucks. You don't see 18-wheelers. The reason is when they distribute stuff, when they ship, they get to the border of a province, they have to unload, carry it across the line, and then load again. And so if you got an 18-wheeler, I mean, it'll take you a month, right? I mean, no matter how many Chinese you got. So they have a lot of these little trucks because for them, it's more efficient. And so those barriers between provinces create artificial inefficiencies. Okay, so there's a lot of protection, local protection. Government policy favors companies that look large, but they're not fully integrated. Those examples I showed you before. You know, there's a lot of these collusions and things going on, but they're not really very efficient. And then regional integration prevents overall scale. You don't get these large Chinese companies that dominate because they can't really coordinate across the entire country. Markets as well are very split. A lot of parochialism, regionalism. They each have their own favorite beverage and so on. There aren't really national markets like we think about here. And so competition domestically is very hostile. So you don't get these large companies building up. These local companies identify with the community and not the parent. Hubei, Wuhan, those clusters I showed you before identify locally. Again, hinders coordination. There's a lot of duplication, excess capacity, a lot of overlap, no scale. And they focus on cost. So, of course, they're going to pay labor very little. They're going to pollute, no safety. I mean, you know, a lot of guys are named Lefty because, kind of, you know what I mean, or 8 fingers or something. I mean, they don't really care. Expendable, intellectual, no investments in IP. Looking out for tomorrow, it's like, well, we'll just, you know, if they catch us doing something wrong, we'll close shop and we'll just get another logo and just open up across the street. And they lack what we call soft power. That is the ethics, the values, the culture. It's just, they don't really, you know, get it. No depth of management. I got a dear friend of mine over there who, when I visit in Shanghai, he invites me to talk to his manager. So I went over once and he said, tell him about management, whatever the latest thinking is, leadership. I said, all right, fine. So we go in this conference room and I start talking about this stuff. And they just say, well, we just want to talk about our things. All right, fine. So we opened it up. Well, my friend reads all this stuff. He knows all the literature. And he's really excited about current theory, so he invited me over. Well, they started opening up and talking. What do you think the problem was, as far as they saw it? My friend. Oh, yeah, he talks a big game. You know, what's that saying, you know the words, but you can't do the song, or something like that? He talks a big game. He reads that stuff. He knows it all, but he doesn't practice it. Culture is so deep that they don't delegate. They're very controlling, very heavy-handed. So every little item that comes through, he had to see, he had to sign it. He had to, big on chops, these, you know, red stamps. He had to do everything. No depth of management. So you have these one guy, you know, they do it all. Family businesses have the same problem. I went down to a town called Wenzhou along the coast, which is famous for entrepreneurs. I went to this like a little GE, very progressive company. General manager showed me around. He was trained in the West. He spoke fluent English. We had a great time. We had karaoke and all that. A few months later, I call him on his cell phone. He goes, I'm in Shanghai, which was hours away, you know, from where we had been. I go, what are you doing here? He goes, I'm consulting. What happened? He ran into the glass ceiling. Family-run business, there was no room at the inn for an outsider. And so the depth of management, one of the problems they have is they don't really promote, you know, others, and so they get into these kinds of bias. So part is cultural, part is family, a lot of these, you know, traditions. So anyway, that's another problem. So they don't get these global brands, and if they do learn something, they don't really translate it, they don't transfer it, it doesn't really go anywhere. Maybe it stays in a mainland. So we don't see these Chinese global brands, except for this. No. Cut their own throat, cutthroat competition. And then, of course, the toys, you know, all the scandals we've had with China, just, they don't care. You know, they cut costs, they cut their own throat, but it hurts them in the long run. But that's, the short-sightedness prevents the global branding. It's cheap manufacturing. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Okay, let's move on. Another Chinese proverb, same bed, different dreams. Partnering. Multinationals. All the large multinationals have an operation over in China. Either regional headquarters or R&D. Intel is over there, IBM is there, Dell has R&D over there. They're all over there with R&D. Microsoft has R&D over there. They're all involved with R&D centers, right? Or manufacturing, you know, operations. A lot of reasons. One is they've got good scientists who don't charge a lot of money, right? And also you need to learn that market. You need to learn those local needs and requirements. And so sometimes you go over to learn something, you apply elsewhere, which is really the next item. Multinationals look at success based on current profits. They should look at a long term, such as how do you do business in China? How do we gain access to the government regulators? How do we build brand awareness? How do we develop all these kinds of things? But the one good example over there that I like was Buick, the largest automobile factory in Asia outside of Toyota in Japan. The largest one is Buick in Shanghai. Joint venture between General Motors and the Shanghai government. They went in there a few years back, and they targeted the middle market. And everybody said, you're crazy. You got Volkswagen on the low end, no one's going to buy it. And the response was, well, we're going to learn. And maybe we won't make a lot of money here, but whatever we learn, we might be able to apply elsewhere. So for them, it was about learning. And they wound up making money pretty quickly. It didn't really take them that long. So it's that long-term attitude that I think is more important. So the R&D thing also ought to be more for learning, something that you can apply elsewhere. Okay, now on the Chinese side, what they want is secure employment. They love working for Western companies, American companies especially. Well, we pay better, but we treat them better, and we have more job security. There's a lot of job hopping over there, especially between the Chinese companies, but they really would love to work for a foreigner. They place a lot of emphasis on learning from us as well. Just back to when we had JVs go over, they would learn a lot from those JVs. Same thing now. They want to have these reforms, especially for the SOEs, so they would restructure, they would re-engineer, learn about business and industry. So you bring in all of these things as a partner and hopefully help prop up those failing businesses. So each side has something, same bed, different dream, something to offer.
It sounds like especially the stuff they want to learn is so counter to the cultural.
A lot of this is what I call, this is the soft stuff. Chinese are really good on the hard stuff, low cost manufacturing, imitation. It's this soft cultural stuff and really getting an intuitive feel for doing business that is kind of hard for them. But I think it's not just culture, I think it's more historically because of heavy-handed government and the way things have been done for decades. And if you try something different, it might cost you your life. So there's a lot of history there that, I think is still with them. Like when Mao he would have these proclamations and a million people would die, go, oops, my bad, and then try something else. I mean, he had all these things, like one day he said, you know what, the traffic lights, red is our color, so red should mean go. Green, must mean stop. Proclamation, bunch of car accidents, people went crazy. So, well, okay, my bad, So whenever they do, they do these things on a large scale, build a dam, it doesn't work, a million people drown, oops, try. So there's a lot of history of just these mistakes that are very costly. Okay, now, I thought I'd show you the largest acquisitions as well. So we're talking about partners and trade and getting involved over there. The first bunch, 100% ownership. And this is the value. And then this next bunch, not quite 100%, but still a pretty large stake, but I ranked it by the value of the acquisition. Let me know what you think. FedEx, eBay, UPS, Amazon, DuPont, Bank of America, 9% stake in China Construction Bank, Yahoo, 2 different acquisitions. Warburg Pincus is an investor. They're not an operator. So I guess they invested in this pharmaceutical company, Bausch & Lomb, Heinz, and so on, Starbucks, Google. So M&As have really opened up. You never know where something comes from, right? All right, that's the point I was trying to make before. Okay, let's look at M&A. Today, you can buy. In fact, they're encouraging you to go in and buy, take over. Now, 8 years ago or so, I'd gone over, come back. A friend of mine was working for Business Week. Went down to New York City, we had dinner, said, hey, anything interesting happened the last trip? So we were talking, I said, I think M&As are really going to open up. He goes, no way. No way they're going to open up. They're not going to sell out, to foreigners and this and that. A few years later, they changed the laws, they opened it up, and here we are restructuring. So a qualified, whatever that means, you got to be qualified, foreign institutional investor, you can buy up to 20% of the shares, both A and B, which is domestic and foreign shares. There are some restrictions, and there are some currency conversion restrictions to profit. There's some restrictions, and you got to do it for a certain amount of period of years, depending on who you are and so on. So it's some restrictions, but still you can go in and 3 years down the road, maybe cash out. Now, if this results in it holding 30% or more, I emailed a friend of mine who works in Hong Kong, actually works in most of the cities, but Hong Kong mostly for, I think it's Goldman Sachs. Got his PhD at MIT, he knows this stuff. I said, how come it's 20% there, and if you can't do more than 20%, how are you ever going to get to 30%? Because these were two different places I caught that, and he said, I don't know, it's just Chinese. One guy has a law here, another agency does this, so it doesn't make sense to me, but I'm just repeating whatever is in this publication. So if you get more than 30%, right, then you got to buy everything at a price to be determined. Remember, the price is not exactly like free market price, right? So the government will come in and they'll evaluate the assets or whatever. They'll tell you what the price is. You can get shares of non-listed. You can buy shares even if they're not on the stock exchange, or you can buy the assets. Just buy the assets, not the stock. And if you're already in China, then you can restructure. You can buy or sell or change your assets through merger and acquisition. All right, so there's a lot of juggling around of these companies and assets that are still possible. So M&As have really opened up in China. The other aspect is SOE restructuring. A lot of people think that China went WTO because it forced SOEs to get more efficient. Everyone knows they're bloated, everyone knows they're inefficient, but the government really did not feel they could be the ones to make them change. So instead, WTO is forcing it. So they passed a law permitting restructuring, where a foreign investor can come in, buy an SOE. Remember before they had thousands they want to get rid of and just do without. You can buy them under these conditions. If coming in, you have the ability and technology that they need, if you've got the credit and management capability and sound finances and economic strength. So if you're a qualified buyer, you can come in. The this SOE inviting you must do these two things. One is have a plan that shows you how you're going to improve governance structure. That's kind of interesting, a lot of new governance emphasis, and develop the enterprise, and also a detailing new products, technology. Remember before, these new investors are expected to help with product technology innovation and strengthening their management in similar matters. So the soft stuff as well. However, before applying for approval, the SOE first must take care of the workers. Like pension liabilities, things of that sort. You have to make sure you're not going to fire everybody, because that's going to create a lot of problems, with the government. So you got to still protect social stability, no massive layoffs, and workers have a veto on whatever the plan is. So the workers still have a lot of say. There is restructuring. I don't know which ones are buying and selling now, but that'll be interesting to kind of see. But there's a lot of, the SOEs are on the block, except for those pillar and protected industries. A lot of them are on the block. Yeah. Okay, let me give you these Chinese companies that are coming overseas. Some of them we've already mentioned. Haier, I mentioned before, the small appliances. They have 26 subsidiaries overseas. There are 13 factories, including one in South Carolina. And I was walking down, I was by the library, Manhattan, so where's Fifth Avenue, I guess, or no, I was on 6th Avenue, I was behind. I'm walking down 6th Avenue of the Americas, so library like 40th Street or so, right? And I walked by this building, and did a quick double, because I saw this bronze plaque on the building. And I go, whoa, It was higher. So they actually purchased their U.S. headquarters, America's headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. So Haier now, they're going overseas. Huawei, the Cisco competitor, also has a lot of R&D headquarters. So we have R&D there, but they also have R&D here. They have a joint venture with 3Com, and they got contracts. They beat Cisco and Nortel. Now, I also mentioned this company before, the automotive parts maker. They also have a lot of overseas firms. They purchased a large stake in a Chicago automotive parts producer, which now will manufacture stuff, for them. And that was permitted because they would have gone under anyway, protected the jobs, protected the business in Chicago. I'll give you 3 more examples. CNOOC made the news not too long ago. Do you remember they'd made the bid for Unical? They tried to purchase Unical, and the Congress, U.S. Congress, put a stop to it. So another petroleum company, TCL, they make TVs and so on. They purchased Schneider. Now Schneider, then they had a joint venture with Thomson. Thomson had purchased GE's TV business. And so basically, if you get a GE set today, you're buying Chinese TCL. Because GE doesn't make TVs anymore. They had sold it to Thomson. Now TCL is doing it all for all of them. So they're a large company, and they're going to go into Vietnam as well. Lenovo, I mentioned, had purchased IBM's PC unit a few years ago. So if you have a ThinkPad, it's Chinese. So these are all the Chinese companies that you don't think about, but yet they're pretty prominent global players. I think it's outrageous that we allow China to buy American companies. Pretty soon they'll own the entire United States. But who's the enemy here, right? I mean, if you're going to Walmart is nothing but a distribution chain for Chinese manufacturers. Walmart opened, remember I mentioned Shenzhen earlier, it's by Hong Kong? Shenzhen was a sleepy fishing village like 20 years ago, and now it's one of the largest cities there. Walmart has their huge regional headquarters there in Shenzhen, and all around them are all these manufacturers. So this whole supply chain through China gets on the docks in Shenzhen, and Walmart is right there. My stepson and I were in Walmart a couple of years ago, and he had a globalization project. And I said, look, let's just do a little test here. Pick any aisle. Pick any product. And I bet you 90% of whatever you pick randomly is made in China. Sounds reasonable? I was wrong. He bet me and I lost. It was 100%. I was off by 10%. We cannot find one thing not made in China. All right? So when you think about, this trade stuff, keep that in mind. Okay, let's move on to technology and innovation. No country's ever before made a better run at climbing every step of economic development all at once. No country plays the world economic game better than China. No other country shocks the global economic hierarchy like China. One of the criticisms, though, is it's imitation. It's not innovation. Chinese companies make up 12% of their high-tech exports. Multinationals make up the 88%. All right, so again, it's imitating low-cost manufacturing. It's not global brands. It's not new stuff. It's not high-tech. With Huawei, the one exception. Chinese innovation is very opportunistic. Short run, quick payoff, imitation, that kind of thing. Most Chinese companies really can't seem to follow up with products. They don't do a lot of things like Silicon Valley does, collaborate, work together. The incentives aren't quite there. And so this article from Wall Street Journal earlier this year lays out some ideas that they need to do to be more like Silicon Valley. It's the people you have there, the venture capital you have there, the investment, the patient capital, intellectual property rights, and so on. However, this is, the C is copyright. So this is China, the problem with copyright protection, intellectual property. Until they get over that hurdle, it's still going to be a problem. Well, recently, though, they've gotten better. You know why they've gotten better? Because more and more Chinese companies in China find it's to their own interest to protect their intellectual property. And so once they all realize they're all in the same boat, then they start playing that same game. So what they did was they created a Silicon Valley outside of, in the outer reaches of Beijing. It's still in Beijing. The northeast part of Beijing are all the major universities, northeast corridor. So they created, like Silicon Valley built around Stanford, the same thing. In 1988, it was the first, the largest, and the most well-known tech region in China, and still, still pretty prominent. They're a leading incubator for high-tech businesses. 400,000 people? That's a big number. 400,000 people in that one tech park. Remember I told you, take Albany campus, take everybody from the city of Albany. Well, do that 4 times, and you kind of get the gist of this. 138 top research institutions, Chinese Academy of Sciences, all these universities I mentioned before, and 6,000 companies, mostly IT and internet, 6,000 companies. This region would really be hopping without many. I mean, we go crazy because maybe AMD is going to break ground in Malta. Maybe, maybe not. 6,000 companies, so that gives you kind of the sense of the magnitude of differences. So they're trying on the tech and innovation. Okay, entrepreneurs. Another proverb, the mountain is high and the emperor is far away. Entrepreneurs, the further they are from Beijing, the more entrepreneurial they get. So Canton has always been kind of the hub, and that's always been the jumping off ground for overseas Chinese. They would leave from Canton or Xiamen, also on the coast, and they're more independent. So a lot of entrepreneurial activity, and even when Deng Xiaoping made his trip, he went to Canton and he saw these entrepreneurs there. So further away you are from central government, the more independence you feel. Let's I'll show you a quick comparison between traditional Chinese and Western practices. The objective for a traditional Chinese firm is for the family. In the Western, it's the stockholder. Financial data for traditional Chinese family business is private and secretive. Remember, transparency is always a problem. They're never direct. They don't divulge more than they have to. In the West, one of the institutions that we take for granted are audits, the SEC, and so on, things we take for granted that are, they don't really have. Whoops, wrong one. I better go back to the old-fashioned way of doing this. Excuse me, my battery might have just gone on me. Okay, let me just try this. We're down at about 15 minutes, so I'll try to get through some more of this, or maybe not. I think we have a technical problem. You're going to edit all this, right? Oh, here we go. Do this right here. Whoops. Okay. Traditional, objective, financial data. Okay, financing sources, family and friends. Don't go to bankers. You don't trust the banks anyway. Here, investment bankers, stock exchanges, longevity. They don't sell family, these businesses. They have all these obligations. But in the West, mergers, consolidations, a lot of battle for control. Sales are based on who you know. You sell to your family members. In the West, building brands. Recruitment, nepotism, I tell you the story about the glass ceiling, that individual I met over there, patriarch. Here in the West, it's based on merit, time horizon, long term. It's all about the family prestige. You're doing it for the family. Here are quarterly profits. Now, as a result, family businesses that are successful also tend to get into unrelated businesses that make no sense. Why? Exactly. Well, not their children, but in-laws. Yeah. So it's all in a family. So oftentimes, it's like, okay, well, here's, whoever, time for another business. Let's go get something else. And they get into all these business, for a family. So that's one aspect, is they're very diversified. The other aspect is, wherever you go, there's a Chinatown. Wherever you go, it's a Chinatown. These extended families will support each other to go abroad. financially, business connections. It's an investment that will pay back later on. So they're very, very much aware of that. It's very common. So the family businesses have always been a tradition with the Chinese. Here are some of the most successful entrepreneurs. The first one is kind of an anomaly. I think she inherited quite a bit, a lot of real estate in there. Look at the industry, solar panel, kind of interesting, a lot of real estate. It's like Japan had a big real estate bubble years ago. Sports apparel, Coke, insurance, Coke. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit more about this one. These are all over $1 billion. That wealth is mostly stock. All right, it's not always cash in the bank. Now, Shanda makes, what they do is online entertainment. Dungeons and Dragons or that, you want these kids to go online and they, So what happened was this guy founded the company in '99 with his family and with his classmates. And the business sells massive multiplayer online role-playing games, MMORPG. It's now China's largest entertainment company. Now, entertainment includes businesses like Disney, which is now in Shanghai. He's larger than all the entertainment companies because of this one business. In 2003, a couple of businesses invested money in it, but then later they sold their shares on NASDAQ. Well, when they sold it for $100 million, it became one of the biggest NASDAQ success stories. He got into these other businesses which didn't really do too well. 2005, he switched his business model. Well, the stock crashed. And he thinks it's because they don't really understand all of these changes he went through. He was sued by a South Korean game developing company, and he responded by buying out its parent. That ended the lawsuit, like negated the lawsuit, just buy him out. Anyway, here's a business. He's got over $500 million accounts, a third of the market. Revenues this year is expected to be 300 mil. Market is growing 30% a year. Through 2011, and the industry ought to be more than $3 billion. However, the stock goes up and down. Much of the business was built on games that now are not as appealing. Investors have run up the shares. I mentioned before, a lot of times the stock market gets too hot and just overvalued. But then there's disappointment and a lack of games coming out. So the current market now is valued at $2 billion. He sold 12.8%. He cashed out $157 million in September, but he still has over 60% of the shares. Not a bad deal. You still control the majority of the company, and you're walking away with $157 million. The reason I went to Boston is because one of my friends out there is the PR guy for these guys. So he called me, he goes, I'll be in Boston Sunday. So I drove out to see him for the day. I go, what's going on? I'm on a road show. What's a road show? He had to go around the country explaining what the company's doing. And I asked him, well, why did this guy sell out? I mean, what's he going to do with $157 million? He said, well, he got 2 daughters who are going to school. I go, what's he going to do, buy Harvard? You're going to buy Harvard for, I mean, what, but anyway, this is just one example, but the wealth is the stock price run-ups. Start a company, sell the stock, get the run-up, and then go on the road show to keep pumping that stock up. But still, they can control the vast majority of the company by maintaining most of the shares. Okay, change. The only constant is change. To me, these are the 10 primary forces that really was in this transition that got it going about 10 years ago. We've talked about most of these. One is free trade zones. I mentioned free trade zones earlier. When you have free trade zones, you expose the local market to outside influence, something that for a long time they try to avoid. Well, they've decided to open it up in very select areas. There are a lot of different kinds of structures that they were able to experience and experiment with. JVs, FIEs, we've talked about all of them. So a proliferation of all these different structures, a lot of experimentation on alternative ways of running a business. WTO, bringing market forces to bear on these Chinese companies, create advantages for both multinationals and also local companies. ISO, International Standards Organization, have requirements for doing global businesses and other standards. And so by forcing quality and environmental requirements, trying to make them more into line with global standards. Sea turtles, returning Chinese students, overseas Chinese coming back to China. A lot of our MBAs, for instance, they from China come here and then they go back. Opportunities there are pretty good. So they go home, and that's been an influence as well. The internet, opening things up. I mentioned the Great Wall to keep out influence, but today, the internet, has a lot of foreign influence and exposure. It also allows people like that game I showed you to create business at home online. Stock market, financial reporting, accounting, that was also a boost. I think the stock market's a casino, but it does provide equity financing. It enables more people to share in the wealth of the growing economy. It provides incentives of different kinds, and also forces some kind of reporting and accounting standards. English is the universal business language. A lot of people grow up learning English, understanding English, and it's important for business. As a Westerner, as someone who speaks English, we take it for granted, but most everybody else conforms to English. Western business etiquette, they're learning how to relate in their organizations, management practices and so on. And I think, lastly, training and consulting organizations, you see more and more, not only MBA programs, but consultants going in and helping them do some of the things we've talked about, the soft side as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about training, and we only have a few more minutes, so I'll try to get to that as well. Now, and this change, one of the changes is that they're shifting from export to domestic growth, domestic consumption. Here's a changing diet over 4 generations. People I know, their grandparents grew up on rice, their parents grew up on veggies, they grow up on meat, right? And so we go from the stereotype, this is Yao Ming, but with the shift to consumption, the 4th generation grew up on Big Mac. So look how they've changed from this to this. It's a real health concern over there. So the consumption is a downside. Yao Ming to me symbolizes the growth and power and the wealth of Chinese manufacturing, but now perhaps in the decline as they move from export to consumption. There's also more focus on rural economic development, moving to the countryside, education, healthcare, also pensions and so on. What they've done is they've reduced taxes in the interior. They have a minimum wage. They're developing infrastructure. And they're also encouraging more consumer credit. So they're becoming more like us in many ways. Let me just show you this last chart, and I think we'll probably have to wrap it up. Here, I want to compare supply and demand. Up on the left is China export compared to world consumption. This is China consumption compared to the world consumption. And these are the major products that they make. But if you draw a line through here, on the upper left, bicycles, clocks, watches, microwaves, and apparel, those are pretty much export driven. China export compared to the world consumption, they ship out quite a bit. Here, motorcycles, air conditioners, TVs, cement, rice, washing machines, more consumption driven. They consume more proportionally compared to the world. And so all the things they make are not necessarily for export, but also for consumption. Anyway, I was going to talk about opportunities and all that as well, but I think we pretty much run out of our time. Well, it's been a pretty long afternoon. We covered a lot of territory. There's a lot more territory to still cover, but thanks for a wonderful session here, and I hope you got something out of it. As you see, it's very complex. I certainly enjoyed talking about it, and please feel free to contact me if you have any further questions.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.